Thanks, big man, for letting me share. My name is Adrian M, and my clean date is March 4th, 2018. I was born in 1987, Los Angeles, California. Raised by a single mother. I've got two sisters. I'd have to say my earliest memory of witnessing people intoxicated would be my mom used to have these parties, get-togethers. I was young. This is when we were still in LA. And I just know that it was always a bunch of grown-ups hanging out. And there was pizza. And then everybody's breath smelled like booze. And this one night, my uncle got into it with some guy, and this guy went to throw a drink at him, and a drink landed in my face, and they got into a big old fist fight. I remember that chaos. Chaos. My mom got remarried when I was 8 years old, and we moved to Colorado Springs. And the man that she married was a heavy drinker. And we butted heads a lot. He didn't have any children of his own. And I suppose my personality type didn't really mesh well with his. So I was singled out a lot for it. At a very young age, I remember being angry, but not really being able to do anything about it. Being picked on by this guy. And he was abusive. Certain things that have been seared into my mind that I still think about on a daily basis. My mom was married to him for 4 years. I think I was in the room about 3 of those years. The only time I was allowed to come out was when I would hear him call me boy. And I would know that I needed to grab him a beer and take it to him. I was young and impressionable, and I thought that every kid went through what I went through at that age. So I didn't think that I was going through anything serious. It wasn't until my mom eventually divorced him, and we were having a conversation one day, that I realized that she did not know. And that added another level of anger and almost like I was taken advantage of. Right after that happened, we moved to Ohio. And by this time, I'm 12 years old. And I started skateboarding. Around this time, I had met my dad for the first time, my biological father. And he had bought me a skateboard. And I grew very attached to it because when I played football, my mom's ex-husband became a coach. And because of that experience, I didn't want to play any organized sports. So I excelled at skateboarding. Plus, it was something that my dad had bought me, so I used that as a way to kind of connect with him as much as I could. That's my 8th grade year. I turned 13 in November, and I remember hanging out with my buddies, and one of my buddies pulled out looked like a little cigarette that he had hand rolled, and I took a couple puffs off of it, and I remember feeling like I was in a dream. I had tunnel vision. As you can guess, I was stoned for the first time. And there was something about it that made me want to partake in it again. And I mean, back then it was just fun, you know. We would smoke a little weed and skateboard and bike, and shortly after that I got drunk for the first time with one of my cousins. And I'll never forget it because I drank 4 Budweiser long neck bottles and 5 Natty Lights. And I puked on the side of his bed for 12 hours and felt horrible the next day. I guess the term would be hairy teeth. And that was the first time I told myself I would never drink again. 2 weeks later, my buddies and I, we started getting into these habits where we would stand outside of convenience stores. We used to call it fishing, and get old guys to buy us cigarettes or beers. Sometimes we'd go to drive-thrus and, while the clerk wasn't looking, steal beers and run out. And I would go to school, skateboard, and get really drunk with my friends. At this time in my life, I was living with my aunt, who was a little bit more strict than my mom, so I always had to hide it from her. And I remember the feeling that gave me. It was almost like it was a thrill, because not only am I doing something that I'm not supposed to be, I have to do it in a way that I won't get found out. These are all things I think of nowadays because of the way it's manifested itself in my life up to this point. So it's all fun and games. And, you know, I've got silly stories too, like one time being super stoned and cutting the grass, and I cut it in a different pattern the way I usually would, and my aunt came home from work and was like, "What did you do to the grass?" And I went and looked at it, and there's like mohawks in the yard. I did a very bad job, but that was all fun. It was all funny back then. I had enough discipline from my aunt and my mom to still stay in school, do my homework. At this point in my life, the thought of it overpowering everything else hadn't crossed my mind yet. Even though at this point in my life I did have friends that were dropping out. Let's see, I moved around a lot as a kid. So after 8th grade, I started 9th grade in Akron, Ohio. And I had to meet a whole different group of friends that were skateboarders and didn't really drink. I remember feeling like, well, they don't really hang out like my friends in Lorain do. Lorain's up by Cleveland. That's where my family's from. We'd moved there after my mom divorced my stepdad. But anyway, by 9th grade, it was just all about skateboarding. And I guess now when I think about it, that was my addictive personality because I did let skateboarding overshadow my schoolwork. School was boring. And this is back in the day, you know, like if you were bored in school, you were bored in school, you know. They wanted to put me on ADD, or Ritalin and stuff like that. My mom told them to put me in smarter classes, but because of my behavior, they wouldn't. So I spent a lot of time in school suspension. I guess it was just me trying to show off and trying to adjust to different people. Well, halfway through 9th grade, I moved back to Lorain, and I get back with my old friends, and the drinking excelled, and now we started smoking weed before school. It was just something we did, you know. I thought it was normal, even though nowadays, if I knew kids that were that young that were hanging out like that, I'd probably have something to say about it. So 10th grade comes along, and I moved to Mansfield. This is 3 schools in a matter of 1 full school year. So I start 10th grade in Mansfield, whole nother group of people. And by this time, I had this technique. I would wear an ICP shirt. I wasn't a juggalo or anything, but I would wear an ICP shirt my first day of school so that I would automatically have a group of friends to identify with. And it never failed me, you know. Now, the downside of that is the people that I had around me were a little bit loose around the edges. But I was just a skateboarder. That's all I wanted to do was skate. And I got good at it. I got really good at it. Consequently, I started exploring different things. I started, this is after puberty, so I started having facial hair, and I was able to buy beer. And I'm about 15 at this time. And pretty much, let's see, I'm getting out of control. My mom can't control me. So I was getting suspended out of school every week for something stupid I was doing. And I had done something stupid in school. And then the weekend came. Well, for a couple months prior to this point, we had been filming a skate video, and there was vandalism involved. I'm sure you guys remember Jackass. And we vandalized one of our friend's basements, and his mother got the tapes and turned them over to the cops. Because of that, I got put on probation. My probation officer tells me, if you go back to school and get in any trouble, we're going to expel you and you're going to do 180 days in juvie. So I go back to school, and the thing that I had done the previous week caught up with me, and it happened to be the thing that got me expelled. My mom had to come pick me up from school, and right when I got in the car, she told me that I was going to live with my dad. And I felt like it was unfair. I didn't meet my dad till I was 12, and we really had little communication. I really didn't know him. And he lived in Las Vegas. So not only was I moving again, but I had to get ready to meet new people, and I had to get ready to be around somebody that was absent most of my life. The only thing I knew is that the one thing I loved the most was introduced to me by him. So I move out to Las Vegas, St. Patrick's Day 2003. It's the same day we bombed Baghdad. If anybody remembers that, after 9/11, 2 years later we bombed Baghdad. That's the same day I flew on the plane, landed in Vegas. And my dad was there to pick me up. And he told me 2 things on the car ride home. He said, if you want to get trashed, I'd rather you get trashed with me than somebody else on the streets. That's the first thing. Second thing he said was, if you go to school and get good grades, you can hang out and drink with me and my friends. Up to this point, I think I had had maybe 1 credit for 2.5 years of high school. I'm sorry, at this point, 1.5 years high school. And the credit I had was in German. I really didn't care about school until my dad gave me that motivation. Now, I know it's controversial because I personally don't think that that's a winning recipe, but it worked because that was the motivation I needed, because I wanted to hang out with my dad. So I started doing better in school, but drugs and alcohol really started to evolve. I started learning different things. Coming from Ohio to Las Vegas, was a different atmosphere all in itself. Um, Little things like people would pick on me when I lived in Ohio because I was black and I skateboarded. And when I moved to Las Vegas, people respected it. You know, people thought I was cool, doing something that I loved to do the whole time. I felt accepted, so I was easily influenced. And I mean, in retrospect, that's really all it was about, is going to school, getting enough work done to get that B or C, and smoking weed and drinking with my dad and two guys that he had introduced me to when I moved in with him, and he said they were my brothers, and that's how we were around each other. They were like my brothers. My dad also got me my first drum set at this time. The second time he had done something for me, and by stroke of luck, something I fell in love with. And that's all me and my brother Nate did, was played music. We played in the garage every day. 110-degree days, and we're in the garage. Just me on the drums, him on the guitar, playing Metallica songs, or then he picked up the bass, and I expanded my drum set. It was something I really liked to do, and I got good at it. And with that kind of lifestyle comes drinking and partying. So at that point in time, everything was acceptable. And plus, in my eyes, as a young man, I was doing what I needed to do to hang out. And it was like a rite of passage, because I knew that my dad knew that I was responsible enough to do that. Excuse me. I don't know too many kids 15 or 16 years old whose parents tell them that they have the green light to get trashed as long as they get good grades, and they can actually succeed in that. And I'm pretty sure it was because of my dad's absence. Had he been around my whole life, I'm sure that wouldn't have been a technique. I'm pretty sure it was a last resort thing, and it just happened to work. Little issues started coming up, like I'd go out of my way to talk to my dad about how my day was going, or I'd roll up a little bit of weed. He worked graveyard, so when I was getting out of school at 1:15, he'd be kind of laying down. He wouldn't go to work until midnight that night, but sometimes he'd be off, and I'd always make it a point to get his attention, you know, hey, let's smoke a joint and hang out. And 90% of the time, he was too busy. He was going to the bar with Nate, or he was doing something with D, who was my other brother. And I say it like that because they're almost like foster brothers. They had their own relationships with my dad. And even though I was my dad's biological son, I felt like an outsider a lot of the time. It's weird to think about being in that environment. First of all, Las Vegas isn't a place. A lot of people don't even realize that there's schools in Las Vegas. A lot of people just think of Las Vegas as one street, the Strip. And Vegas is huge. And I had friends that were going through drama that I still haven't seen as a grown man. I had friends that lived in hotels because their parents were addicted to drugs and gambling. I had friends that loved coming to my house because my dad was a stable parent. I mean, we had a nice house. It was a bachelor pad. Live music in the garage. We always had different girls over. It was a fun environment, but my dad was always asking my friends what grade they were in, and then he'd ask them what grade they were supposed to be in. And all the time, everybody was in a grade lower than where they were supposed to be. And my dad would get on them about that. And they'd stop coming over. And I didn't like that because my dad never really was on my case like that. He just perceived himself like that to my friends. I was still learning. I really didn't know how I took that then. But I knew that I liked drinking and I liked smoking weed. Cool things happened up until my junior year. I mean, I went to see Metallica. I was pretty much living the life that anybody could dream of. Beautiful city, beautiful people. People respected you for who you were. It wasn't like Ohio. It wasn't like how I experienced Ohio. And one night on the Strip, best place of all places in the world, I tried cocaine for the first time. Now, this is the first time in my life where I tried a substance that I fell in love with. And I thought about doing it every time since then. I didn't understand it then, but it was, I guess they call it chasing the dragon. I chased after it. I tried to save up my allowance money to buy some, or my best friend at the time, he was already dabbling in it, and he was dabbling in other hard drugs too. And that was the first time that my partying started to overshadow how I felt about school. Because I just wanted to hang out. The summer between my junior and senior year, it was an unforgettable summer. I shot a gun for the first time. I robbed my first house, stole my first car, and I had sex for the first time. I don't know, when I think about it now, I still feel, even the memories that I have of it, I felt alone. Everything I did, I was just one step behind everybody else, all of my peers, except for my drumming. My drumming was something that I excelled in, and nobody really messed with me about that, you know. When I started breaking laws, now there's a method to the madness, you know. I mean, my brother D was like my mentor. He kind of showed me a way of life, doing things like that. And it was something that I was also drawn to. Back in those days, you know, guys in high school, they like to compare how many phone numbers they got. I was into another kind of thing. I called myself a gangster. I like to do stuff like that. So I started hanging out with D and his friends. A lot of his buddies were in a car club. Well, they were all in car clubs, but Elegancia car club, this specific car club, was where some of his closest friends were. And I was very drawn to it. I mean, 16 years old, dope cars, dope ladies, and my peers were like 25 years old, and I'm fitting in right along with them. And I suppose it was because of the childhood I had with my stepfather, or I'm sorry, my mom's ex-husband, and the absence of my dad. I guess it toughened me up. I had heart. And I guess that's what drew me to those guys, or drew them to me. The first time I shot a gun was at a concert. My brother Nate hit some guy in the mosh pit, and he went to hit him back, and the guy ducked, and he hit his girlfriend on accident, and they jumped on him, and long story short, I ended up shooting a gun out of a window, just like in the movies, and that was the day before my senior year. 3 days after that, I got a phone call saying that the second girl I had been with sexually was pregnant. You know, they got these shows on TVs nowadays, Teen Mom and 16 and Pregnant. And if they would have had those shows back then, I would have been on those. I was a statistic. Underage. And I was 16 at the beginning of my senior year. And I remember feeling anxiety, nervousness, but I was happy. There was something I felt like I could do. I said I could be a dad. I didn't think about how I was going to put food on the table or bills or not getting loaded. You know, I was a kid. But I knew that I could do it. So I went out and I got my first job at KFC. And December 28th, 2004, beautiful baby girl that I named Layla was born. And my dad was not at the hospital. My mom and sister were here in Ohio. And it's one of those things we go through. I don't remember really being mad about it until later on in life when I thought about it. Like, you know, where was all my support? But because my dad wasn't there, they wouldn't let me sign the birth certificate because I was still underage. And at that point in time, I did what I could. I went to school and I continued getting loaded. But I learned how to change a diaper, and I learned how to work with a baby, and I fell in love with this little girl that was mine. She was my daughter. And with that comes a certain stigma too. You know, you're the only kid in the high school that has a kid. You're the only one out of all your buddies that has a kid. Just that quick, within a span of mid 2003 to the end of 2004, I went from the ICP kid to the dude with the daughter, you know. And I remember there being nights where I'd get loaded and on uppers and just watch her sleep, or I tried to study her, you know. I know now that's what we call bonding, you know. At that point in time, I was really interested in her growth and development. And I suppose that was the first time realizing that maybe I had a problem with substance. Because the only time she wasn't on my mind is when I was on substances. But I was still drawn to substances. So by this point in time, I had done extra schooling, night school, after school classes, and I was able to graduate on time. June 13th, 2005, I graduated high school. I got my cap and gown, and I had my daughter there with me, and I was very proud. My mom, my aunts came out to visit, and I played the drums with it wasn't really a band. Me and my brother played a show for my graduation party, and it was a really good time. I felt like the odds were against my dad and I, and we had succeeded. His only job was to make sure that I graduated high school on time. And by some stroke of luck, he was able to do that with these weird techniques. So on the outside, it looked like we were functioning. But on the inside, there was a lot of dysfunction. One of the factors being when I found out that Layla's mom was pregnant with her. She was 6 months pregnant, and we had been broken up for a few months. So the question came whether she was mine or not. And it was something that her mother always avoided. And my dad never pursued it either, you know. I was doing what I thought was best. And how that situation was handled has a lot to do with how I've become today. So let's see, back to graduation. I graduated high school June 13th, 2005. The very next day, my dad gives me a Greyhound ticket to come back to Ohio. So just as quick as I went with him, he was done. Go back. And that was the first time I made it a conscious thought to stay sober for the Greyhound trip back. I don't know what it was in particular, but I just didn't want to get loaded. I wanted to enjoy the trip, clear my mind a little bit. And so I got back to Ohio. And when I came back, my mom and my sisters were different. They had evolved. You know, a couple of years prior when I left, the environment in my house was like we had to take our shoes off. Everybody had chores. When I came back from my dad, my sisters were kind of doing whatever they wanted to do. And so was my mom. And I'd never seen my mom in this state of mind before. And I don't want to say it to put a negative spin on my mom or anything, but you know, she had like a couple different boyfriends, whatever. She was enjoying herself, and it was something that I understood at that age. We were old enough to take care of ourselves. And I would tell my sisters that at least she didn't do this when we were younger. So I looked at that as also another maturing right. And the drinking excelled. I had saved up enough money for Layla and her mom to move out with me. Everything seemed to work for a few months. We were kids, and we were trying to raise a kid, and fester in your mind, especially if you have somebody that's not cooperating. When I say not cooperating, I mean gets defensive when I ask. And my only motivation for finding out was so that we could prove paternity, so that I could be on a birth certificate, so that I could have rights, because I knew at this time I had bonded with this little girl, and I wanted to do something for her that my dad didn't do for me and my sisters. And as teenagers do, we got into it. And, you know, I suppose Layla's mom was in a strange land also, coming from Las Vegas to Mansfield, Ohio. She left before I could get a paternity test, and she took Layla with her. And that night, I got super drunk, blacked out, woke up in my buddy's house, didn't know where I was, and I continued to do that every day for a year. In the meantime, I'd gotten a new girlfriend who asked me to marry her, and I said yes. And as soon as I said yes, I thought it was a joke. She grabbed me and took me inside and told her whole family at one time. So I was just going through the motions. Honestly, I didn't know if I loved this girl or not, but I knew that I wanted to be closer to my daughter. And even at the young, ripe age of 18, I still had some idea of where my priorities should be. I just didn't have the courage to say anything, so I drank my emotions away. Now, at this point in time, my mom was doing the same thing, so I didn't really have anybody to talk to. that combined with, that was just a way of life then. My mom had moved out, so the house belonged to my sisters and I. And we had parties and drank, but we all got up and went to work. This is a year after I graduated high school. I remember getting off work. I worked at a car wash at this point in time. And I remember how important it was to have a beer. And it's weird because even at that age, I felt like an old man. You know, I remember thinking that to myself, like, I bet old alcoholics feel this way. Like their mouth waters when they think about malt liquor. And I would get smashed. And I mean, that's all life was about. I knew what I wanted. I knew what my goals and aspirations were as far as Layla went, but I didn't know how to go about doing it. And quite frankly, I was too overindulged to really ask anybody for any advice. My best friend, I asked him to be my best man at my wedding. And he flew out from Las Vegas, and we go to pick him up at the airport, and he's got a t-shirt on with a bride and a groom, and the groom's eyes are X'd out, and it says game over. Subliminal message that spoke volumes, and that's why I needed him there, because I needed advice from a true friend. So now the next question is, how are we going to go about doing this? Well, an 18-year-old, I had my first apartment at this time. And this wedding that we were going to have in this backyard was planned. And I didn't know what to do, so I decided to run. It was a drunken decision. And what I mean run, I mean take my belongings out of the house in a way that she wouldn't notice anything was gone. And me and my buddy were going to jump on a Greyhound and catch one back to Vegas without her knowing, the girl I was going to marry. So we did all of this, and we get to the Greyhound station and it's closed. And that was the first time I remember having a meltdown. I started crying, anxiety. That was the first time in my life that I didn't know what to do. I didn't attribute anything to drugs and alcohol at that point. And even now, I suppose there's too many factors to really pinpoint one thing. But I remember the feeling that I had. I was helpless. So I had to face the funk. So when we got back to the house, mind you, she had no idea what was going on. She was at her bachelorette party. When she got home, I sat her down and I told her that I thought it was more important for me to be on my daughter's birth certificate than it was to be on a marriage certificate. And of course, you can guess what ensued. Tears and everything like that. And I remember getting defensive. My whole life, I was very protective of my sisters. So when I broke this girl's heart, I expected her brothers to be very malicious about it. So I got defensive right off the bat, just in case anybody tried to come at me. That state of mind is a precursor to the things that follow. So yeah, I successfully called off the wedding. And family members were very happy. Nobody wanted me to do it. And that's what family's for. At the place in my life right now, I wish I had someone there when I got that phone call that Layla's mom was pregnant, because a 16-year-old kid doing what he thinks is best is not always the best thing. And it greatly affected me later on. So August of 2006, I get back in touch with my father, and he asked me to come back out to Vegas. It wasn't like the first time where I was kind of dumped on him. He asked me to come out, and I felt I felt happy. I was obliged. So we get to Vegas. And the very first place I go to see is Layla. She's grown so much. And me and her mother work out a deal. Her mother was still in school at this time. For the record, I had just turned 17 when Layla was born, and her mother was 14. So when I came back, after I graduated a year later, her mother was still in school. So we agreed that I'd watch Layla while she was at school. And it worked out. It worked out. I remember little things like Layla getting used to calling me daddy, or learning how to think in a different mind frame as a parent. And the more I did that, the more I couldn't understand how my dad was. Because there were things my dad tolerated as far as being my dad, but there was always a disconnect there. And I wanted to make sure Layla didn't feel like there was a disconnect between her and I, because I knew firsthand what it was like for a little girl not to have a father. I remember being, at this point I'm 19, thinking about buying a shotgun for Layla's first day at prom, or for when she goes to the prom. And I was always excited about being around 21 when she'd be in school, because I'd be like the youngest father in there, maybe hit on some teachers or something. There was a lot of pride that went along with that. It was something I was always very receptive to, being a father. It always made sense. Let's see, Christmas of 2006 comes along, and my mother and my uncle come to visit. And this is the first time I do cocaine with my mother. And I noticed something that night. And I don't know if it's about people from that generation. They can party and wake up the next day like nothing happened. Their mind isn't saturated with it for the rest of their life. And that's when I realized that maybe my thinking was a little different. Because I couldn't stop thinking about doing it from the first time I did it. But then again, at this point in my life, it wasn't really overpowering anything. A little bit, little things, like being short on my rent money because I partied too much with my brother, and making it a point not to tell my dad, who was going through his own struggles at the time, because we had also started doing cocaine together. Awkward situations like coming home from work and my dad hiding in a closet because he didn't want his girlfriend to know that he was coked out. Mind you, my dad's 6'4", 250, big black dude, hiding in a closet with long johns on and softball socks. I said it before, and I'm going to say it a few more times in this talk. That was a way of life then. I'd gotten a good job at a factory in Vegas. The owner of this warehouse had built this company from the ground up, and we were the second largest manufacturer of mouse pads and counter mats. And I didn't realize it at the time, but had I an opportunity like that nowadays, I'd be very grateful for it. I had good benefits, and I worked my way up. I started there when I was 18, and by the next year, I had gotten my tow motor license, or my certification. it was at that point in my life, my state of mind was work, and there was still the excitement and thrill of breaking the law that started right back up with my brother when I touched back down in Las Vegas. So during the day, I was with my little girl. From the afternoon to midnight, I was at this job. And then after that, we were plotting. Who to take what from who. I stole a car at that point in my life. I'll never forget, it was a 1990 Caprice Classic. And I had a buddy that was juiced in at the DMV, and he got me 10 tags for it. And I threw 22s on it. And the blinkers didn't work. And it was a stolen car with the steering column missing. And I had cops behind me a couple different times, and I used my hand signals, and they're still legal. And I never got pulled over. Certain things like that in my life, I realize now I was lucky. I've had a force field around me, different situations. Had they veered in the other direction, I don't know where I'd be. Especially with a half-pound of weed and a pistol in that stolen car. And I started playing the drums again too. So now when I think back on it, I led different lives. It was like day and night. I had two brothers that were very inspirational to me, that didn't get along with themselves and led two very different lives. And I guess I wanted a piece of both of them. Consequently, there were times that I wasn't able to keep Layla because I was too hungover, or when you live in that kind of life, sometimes you just say no. I mean, I was still young, and eventually the time came, Christmas of 2007, when I called with a box full of gifts that my mom had shipped out from Ohio. And Layla's mother's family told me that I was not allowed to bring that box over, and I was not allowed to reach out to Layla anymore. And in that one split second, I thought about being back in that hospital by myself and not having the option of signing that birth certificate, because I was helpless and there was nothing I could do about it. And I dealt with it with drinking. And I drank, and I drank, and I drank. And when I mean drink, I mean a fifth of Jack Daniels to the neck. Sometimes more, by myself, in my closet, crying over this box of gifts. I handled it very badly. That's when I consciously knew that that aspect of my life was going to take over. I guess now, what I've learned in recovery, I guess I use it as a justification. They took the only thing I loved away from me, so why can't I take it from somebody else? And that was my philosophy. If you had something that I could use better than you, then it's my right to take it, and you can try and stop me. And I was a hothead. I lived life after that like everybody owed me something. And the environment did nothing but solidify that. I earned a nickname as a kid, Haji. My friends used to call me Haji because of Johnny Quest, cartoon Johnny Quest. He had a sidekick, wore a turban. I'm not Middle Eastern, but they called me Haji. And everywhere I moved, I would introduce myself to people like that. Nobody knew my name was Adrian. So when I got to this age and I started indulging in illegal activities more and more and more, the guys at the car club started calling me Haj Loco. And I embellished that name because I earned that Loco, you know what I'm saying? So at that point in my life, that's what everything was about. Partying and trying to scam and see what kind of stuff I could get away with. But still getting up and going to work every day. Now, there are certain situations where alcohol definitely had an effect on a certain situation, and I think this time in my life is when I really started to notice that. My brother Nate had gotten married, and I was dating a girl that was my friend in high school. At this time we had started dating, and her name was Adrian. And we used to get into drunken 20-year-old arguments. And my brother Nate stopped contacting me about 2 months before his wedding. He didn't contact me about a bachelor party, about getting fitted for a tux, or another time in my life when I felt like I was an outsider. And everything, all of this tension, which I dealt with by drinking and getting high. And at this point in my life, I had a partner in crime. She was like my Bonnie. When you have somebody that's got the same nature as you, it changes the circumstance a bit. It's sad too, because people that can be really good for each other can also be very toxic. And us being friends from high school and her seeing my struggle with Layla, she sympathized with me a lot. And I still don't know for sure if I was using manipulation or if I was fully grasping her level of commitment. Meaning, if we ran out of drugs, we had to get more, you know. And she would drain her bank account, because whatever I had in my bank account would be gone. She would do anything I asked her to do. And when I think about that now, it's only by the grace of God that we all got through that unscathed, because I was really living life by the, I don't know what the saying is, by the tail of my coat or something. What's the saying? The saying? I was living in the fast lane, and at this point in my life, I had known that I had been through traumatic things that affected me, and everything that I loved, I could fit on my hand, and when I closed it, that's how I felt about the rest of the world. That sounds corny now to say, and I used to say that with conviction. I just think about a 20-year-old kid saying that to me nowadays. I'd probably laugh at him. But I was really about that life. All this tension leads up to my brother's wedding. And I get to this wedding, and all of my peers are in this wedding. So it's another time in my life when I felt like I was on the outside looking in. And at the reception, my dad tells me that my brother D told them that I was hitting my girlfriend at the time. And I almost felt let down, because my dad was very self-centered in his own addiction. And, you know, it's like So if you guys think I'm hitting this girl, nobody's going to try to save her. You know, you guys are just going to stop calling me and let me beat her to death. You know, Pops, you're not going to give me any kind of, you know, like advice. Like me being a father now, if my son was even accused of hitting a girl, you know, just you got to talk to him about that. Evidently, there's a discord there. So I handled it like the old me would, and I went into the reception and I found D, and I didn't punch him in the face. I slapped him like a woman. I popped it off in the middle of this wedding, and I'm very embarrassed by that nowadays. A wedding is a very sacred ceremony between two people that love each other. I'd be very mad if somebody interrupted my wedding like that, and I know that my wife would be mad too. And I didn't think about that. I thought about making a point, and I was drunk. There was alcohol involved. Of course there was. I mean, I was only that mad because I was always drunk. And I was always that mad because I couldn't afford to get more drunk and high. At that point in my life, I started seeing people in different perspectives. I started realizing that I did have a problem. And I started realizing that my problems were affecting other people around me. And then I also started realizing that everybody had their own individual problems. After that, I lost my job. And I lived in an apartment with my brother D at the time. Now this is Vegas. Everything's more expensive, so I was paying $450 for my half of the rent. And this is back in 2008. My girlfriend Adrian at the time had moved in with us. I didn't ask. I just expected. I don't have a job anymore. You're going to have to cough up your half of the rent. And that's what she did. So I was able to go to the store and steal bottles of booze. I didn't have motivation to go and find a job or do anything to better my situation, but I had motivation to go take liquor. If I could take anything stronger, I would have. You know, I think about this often. I think about my life now, and I think about the space I was in at that point in time. And life sucked back then. It really did. Christmas of 2008, I wake up and my brother D is with his biological family. Excuse me. And I'm home alone. The first Christmas I ever spent alone. I've never woke up in that kind of mood in my life. I was truly alone. And it was Christmas. I didn't have a solution. And I realize now I didn't have a solution because I didn't really, at that point in time, I wasn't thinking of getting out of it. It was just a way of life. Eventually, Adrian showed up and invited me to come to her family's house. And I got to go over there and blend in like I was an upstanding member of society. And her grandmother called me on it. Her grandmother hated my guts from the first time she met me. She really did. And I had respect for that. I really did. Because at this point in my life, I knew I was a piece of shit. Meaning I'm not doing anything productive. I'm not doing anything for myself. I'm just sitting back expecting. I was self-centered. I was really self-centered. And because of the situation with Layla, I felt like that was my justification. Like no one else in the world has been through anything worse than that. As time progressed, my brother D and I, we started doing a lot of hard drugs together. We had always done them together, but I knew things were getting serious when we would start doing them without each other because we didn't want to share. And it also started taking its toll on Adrian. Things weren't fun anymore. And at this point in my life, I was already deep enough that I didn't know how things were going to get better. So I was just going to stuff my emotions. And that's what I did. We lost the apartment. Another thing that was on the back of my mind was that my biological father, the family I had in Vegas, was not there for me. D's biological family was there for him. So when we lost the apartment, he had money or a place to go. Adrian had to beg her father to let me move in, and he didn't like me because I was black. That was always an undercurrent. It made it for an awkward. It was awkward because I wasn't willing to go out and look for a job, and he slept in the living room all day because he worked third. I still don't know what it was inside of me that made me tick that way, because there was a tick, but it was all for the wrong reasons. I was motivated to not be sober. And what's even worse than that is not having the means to really feed your addiction. It drives you nuts. I wanted to be fucked up all the time, and I could only get drunk. That's another milestone in my life too, when I realized that being totally obliterated drunk wasn't enough. I started asking myself, how can somebody be an alcoholic for 50 years when there's so much more stuff out there? And that's a multi-dimensional question. There's really no way to answer that. But like I said, that's all that was on my mind. The year's beginning of 2009 now, I started talking to my mom and sisters again, who were in Ohio. And my mother buys me a ticket to come home. And this is the first time I'd been home since 2006. And in those 3 years, I didn't keep in touch with my sisters or my mom. I figured everybody was doing their own thing. And when I think about it now, it really made life a lot harder because there was a lot of situations where I probably would have had the help that I needed if I would have just picked up the phone. So yeah, I readily took that invitation to come back home. Only thing is, we thought it'd be a good idea on the Greyhound to stop in Denver and see my uncle at the time. Now at this point in my life, I had dabbled with methamphetamines. I compared everything to cocaine, and I liked those because it was like coke but stronger. I had no idea that my uncle was also a addict in that department, which made for a very interesting week that I spent there. Growing up, my uncle was the father figure. I had a couple of father figures in my life. They were there to help my mom, or just to have some kind of male influence. It was always one of my mom's friends or my uncle. This is the first time I saw my uncle in this light. I saw him as an addict. I saw him with his life in disarray. And I saw him struggling. And I felt bad until he offered me to get high with him. That's when all my thoughts went to that. And then it turned into something cool. I get to get high with my uncle, you know. And while simultaneously there's just drama everywhere. And once again, I'm in a foreign land. I'm 1,000 miles from Ohio, and I'm 1,000 miles from Las Vegas. And pretty soon the drugs ran out. And now I'm walking the streets of Denver, going from pawn shop to pawn shop.